The marble floor was cold. That's the first thing Serafina remembered. Not the laughter, not the shame, not the way her husband's friends tilted their champagne glasses in her direction like she was the evening's entertainment. No, it was the cold. The way it seeped through the thin fabric of her dress and pressed against her knees as she knelt there, 7 months pregnant, trembling, in the center of a room that smelled like Cuban cigars and old money. Maximilian Hargrove stood above her, her husband, the father of the child growing inside her, and he was smiling, not the kind of smile a man gives the woman he loves. No, this was the smile of a man who believed he owned the world and everything in it, including her. "Go ahead," he said, swirling his whiskey slowly. "Say it." Serafina's lips quivered. Her hands rested on the cold floor beside her swollen belly, and the weight of the room pressed down on her like a coffin lid. "Maximilian, please." "Louder," he said. His friends, Declan, Brock, and Nikolai, sat sprawled across the leather couches of the penthouse lounge like Roman senators watching a gladiator fall. Declan had his arm draped across the back of the sofa, a smirk carved into his chiseled jaw. Brock, the quieter one, looked uncomfortable but didn't say a word. And Nikolai, Maximilian's closest friend since prep school, he was recording, his phone held casually in his palm, the red dot blinking in the corner of the screen like a heartbeat. "I said, louder, Serafina." She closed her eyes. A tear streaked down her cheek and landed on the marble. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I'm sorry for embarrassing you." But she hadn't embarrassed him. She hadn't done anything wrong. All she had done was ask, quietly, privately, in the hallway outside the lounge, if Maximilian could take her to her prenatal appointment the next morning. That was it. A simple question, a wife asking her husband to be present for the health of their unborn child. And for that, he had grabbed her wrist, pulled her into the room, and told her to kneel. "You see this?" Maximilian said to his friends, gesturing toward her with his glass. "This is what happens when you marry below your station. She doesn't understand boundaries. She doesn't understand that when I'm with my people, she doesn't exist." Declan laughed, a short, hollow bark of amusement. "Bro, you're cold." "I'm honest," Maximilian corrected. "She knew who I was when she signed that prenup. She knew the deal." But Serafina hadn't known the deal, not really, not the real deal. She had believed him when he told her he loved her. She had believed the flowers, the letters, the way he once drove 3 hours in a rainstorm to bring her soup when she was sick. She had believed all of it, because she wanted to, because she needed to, because she had no one else left in the world. And now she was kneeling on a marble floor, pregnant and humiliated, while the man she had trusted with her entire life treated her like a prop in his ego show. But here's where this story takes a turn none of them saw coming. Because within the hour, a knock would come at that penthouse door, and the man standing on the other side, a quiet silver-haired gentleman in a tailored navy suit, would change everything. His name was Aldrich Fontaine, and he was the senior managing director of Hargrove and Whitfield Private Bank, the very bank that carried Maximilian's family name, the bank that funded his lifestyle, his penthouse, his champagne, his arrogance. And he wasn't there for Maximilian. He was there for her. But we'll get to that. First, you need to understand how Serafina ended up in that room, how a woman so gentle, so quietly powerful, found herself married to a man who would make her kneel in front of strangers. Because this story didn't begin with cruelty. It began, like most tragedies do, with love. Serafina Elise Moreau grew up in the kind of small town that doesn't appear on most maps, Thibodaux, Louisiana, a place of cypress trees and church bells, where neighbors still brought food when someone was sick, and where everyone knew everyone's name. Her mother, Colette, died when Serafina was 9, a sudden brain aneurysm that took her in the middle of hanging laundry on a Tuesday afternoon. Her father, a shrimper named Gaston, tried his best, but grief is a slow poison, and by the time Serafina was 14, he had drunk himself into an early grave. That left her with one person, her grandmother, Rosalind Moreau, a tiny woman with silver hair and hands that smelled like lavender and old books. Rosalind raised Serafina in a small cottage at the end of Bayou Road. She taught her to read poetry, to cook roux from scratch, to press wildflowers between the pages of old novels. She also taught her something else, something Serafina wouldn't understand for many years. "The world will try to make you small, chérie," Rosalind used to say, sitting on the porch as the sun set over the bayou. "The world will try to convince you that what you have isn't enough, that who you are isn't enough. But you remember this: still water runs deep, and the quietest rivers carry the most gold." Serafina didn't understand what that meant. Not then. She was just a girl with second-hand shoes and a library card, dreaming of a life bigger than Thibodeau. She earned a scholarship to Tulane University in New Orleans, studied finance, graduated near the top of her class. But the world of high finance was a cold, glittering machine, and Serafina, for all her brilliance, was quiet. She didn't network in the way that mattered. She didn't come from the right family. She didn't wear the right labels. And so, despite her talent, she ended up working as an assistant at a mid-tier wealth management firm in the city, fetching coffee and organizing spreadsheets for men who had half her intelligence but twice her confidence. That's where she met Maximilian. He walked into the firm one afternoon in a charcoal Tom Ford suit, his dark hair swept back, his jaw set like a man who had never once been told no. He was there to discuss a trust restructuring for his family's holdings. The Hargroves were old money, not the kind of rich that flashes gold watches and rents yachts for Instagram, the kind of rich that owns the marina where the yachts are docked, the kind of rich that has a bank named after them. Maximilian was the youngest son, not the heir, that was his older brother Prescott, but close enough to the crown to walk with a king's posture. He was charming in the way that dangerous men often are, all eye contact and well-timed laughter, the kind of man that made you feel like the only person in the room, even when you were surrounded by 100 others. And he noticed Serafina. Not because she was trying to be noticed, she wasn't. She was in the corner, organizing files, her hair pulled back in a simple braid, wearing a blouse she had ironed 3 times that morning because it was the only one with a stain. But Maximilian saw something in her. Maybe it was her stillness. Maybe it was the way she didn't fawn over him like every other woman in the room. Maybe, in his own twisted way, he saw her quiet dignity as a challenge, something to be conquered. He asked her to dinner that night. She said no. He asked again the next day, and the next, and the next. For 2 weeks, Maximilian Hargrove, a man who could have had anyone, pursued Serafina with the intensity of a man on a mission. He sent flowers to her apartment, not roses, but wildflowers, because he had somehow learned that was what she loved. He left handwritten notes at her desk. He waited for her outside the building in the rain with an umbrella and a shy smile that almost made him look human. And eventually, she said yes. The first 6 months were a dream. Maximilian was attentive, generous, and surprisingly tender. He listened to her stories about Thibodeau. He asked about her grandmother. He held her hand on walks through the French Quarter and kissed her forehead goodnight like she was something sacred. But there were cracks, small ones at first, like the way he would stiffen when she mentioned her job, as if the idea of his girlfriend working was beneath him. Or the way he would correct her pronunciation of certain words at dinner, gently, with a smile, but with an edge that made her stomach tighten. Or the way his mother, Constance Hargrove, looked at Serafina the first time they met, a slow, appraising glance from head to toe, followed by a smile that never reached her eyes. "She's quaint," Constance had said to Maximilian, later, thinking Serafina couldn't hear. "But darling, you can't possibly be serious. She's a scholarship girl from the swamps. She owns nothing. She knows no one. She will embarrass you at every turn." Maximilian had paused, and then he had said something that Constance would never have expected. "That's exactly the point, Mother." Because Maximilian didn't want a partner, he didn't want an equal, he wanted a prop, someone grateful enough to stay, invisible enough to ignore, and powerless enough to control. He married her anyway, but not for the reasons Serafina believed. See, Maximilian Hargrove had a problem. His trust fund, a $30 million endowment established by his late grandfather, had a morality clause, a provision that stated in no uncertain terms that the funds would only be released in full upon marriage and the birth of a legitimate heir. Prescott, his older brother, had already fulfilled this requirement. Maximilian had not, and the clock was ticking. He was 34. The clause expired at 35. He needed a wife, he needed a child, and he needed someone who wouldn't ask too many questions. Serafina was perfect. He married her in a small ceremony at the Hargrove estate, a sprawling plantation-style manor on the outskirts of Baton Rouge. Serafina wore a simple ivory dress. She had no family to invite. Rosalind had passed away the year before, quietly in her sleep, leaving Serafina a small cottage, a box of old letters, and a set of instructions that Serafina had placed in a drawer and forgotten. The wedding was beautiful, but it was a transaction. Serafina just did. And Serafina, who had lost every person she ever loved, who had no friends in this city, who had signed a prenup she barely understood because Maximilian had told her it was just a formality. Serafina believed him, because what else could she do? She was alone, she was pregnant, and the only person in her world was the man who was slowly, methodically erasing her. The cruelty escalated. It always does. It never arrives fully formed. It creeps in like fog, soft and almost invisible at first, until one morning you wake up and realize you can't see the road ahead anymore. It started with silence, long stretches of it. Maximilian would come home, walk past her without a word, pour himself a drink, and disappear into his office. Serafina would sit on the sofa, her hand on her growing belly, listening to the muffled sound of his voice through the closed door, laughing, talking, living a life that didn't include her. Then came the financial control. He took her name off the joint account. He told her it was a banking regulation. It wasn't. He gave her a weekly cash allowance of $200, which was supposed to cover groceries, personal items, and anything else she might need. For a woman living in a multi-million-dollar penthouse, she was being rationed like a servant. One afternoon, she asked for extra money to buy prenatal vitamins. Maximilian looked at her over the top of his laptop and said, "Are you serious? I gave you $200 on Monday. What did you do with it?" "I bought groceries for both of us." "Then eat less." She was 5 months pregnant. The loneliness was perhaps the cruelest weapon of all. Serafina had no friends in the city. The few acquaintances she had made at her old job had faded away after she quit, and Maximilian's social circle treated her with the polite indifference reserved for furniture. She began talking to the baby, out loud, sitting by the window at 3 in the morning when the penthouse felt like a tomb and the city lights blurred through her tears. She would press her hand to her stomach and whisper, "I'm going to get us out of here, little one. I don't know how yet, but I will. I promise." The baby would kick, and Serafina would close her eyes and pretend it was an answer. By her 5th month, Maximilian had stopped pretending entirely. He stayed out late. Sometimes he didn't come home at all. When he did, he smelled like perfume that wasn't hers, a sweet, cloying scent that clung to his collar like a confession. Serafina never asked about it. She was afraid of the answer. But the worst part wasn't the infidelity, it was the contempt. He began making comments, small at first, then sharper, about her body, which was changing with the pregnancy, about her clothes, which no longer fit properly because he refused to give her money for new ones, about her intelligence, her background, her family. "You know, your grandmother was probably just a housekeeper who got lucky," he said one evening, scrolling through his phone while she cooked dinner. "That cottage she left you, it's probably worth less than my watch." Serafina set the spoon down slowly. Her hands were shaking, but she didn't cry. She had learned that crying only made it worse. Tears were an invitation for him to twist the knife deeper. "She was a good woman," Serafina said quietly. Maximilian didn't even look up. "She was poor, Serafina. There's no virtue in poverty. There's only failure." She wanted to scream. She wanted to throw the pot at his head. She wanted to walk out the door and never come back. But where would she go? She had no money, no job, no family. The prenup, which she had finally read in full during one of Maximilian's absences, stated that in the event of divorce, she would receive nothing, no alimony, no property, nothing. She would leave the marriage exactly as she entered it, with nothing. And she had a baby coming. So she stayed. She stayed, and she endured. She told herself it was temporary, that once the baby came, things would change, that Maximilian would see his child and remember the man he used to be, or at least pretend to be. She was wrong. The night of the kneeling, the night this story truly begins, started like any other. Maximilian had told her he was having friends over for drinks. She had prepared the penthouse, cleaned, arranged the bar, set out hors d'oeuvres. He hadn't asked her to do any of this. She had done it because that's who she was. Even in the darkest corner of her marriage, Serafina Moreau was someone who cared. When Declan, Brock, and Nikolai arrived, Maximilian ushered them into the lounge and closed the door. Serafina retreated to the bedroom. She sat on the edge of the bed, her hand on her growing belly, listening to the muffled sound of his voice through the closed door, laughing, talking, living a life that didn't include her. When Declan, Brock, and Nikolai arrived, Maximilian ushered them into the lounge and closed the door. Serafina retreated to the bedroom. She sat on the edge of the bed, her hand on her growing belly, listening to the muffled sound of his voice through the closed door, laughing, talking, living a life that didn't include her. She had an appointment the next morning, a routine ultrasound. She had been going alone to every appointment so far, sitting in waiting rooms surrounded by couples, watching other husbands hold their wives' hands, rub their backs, ask the doctor questions with wide, eager eyes. She wanted Maximilian there, just once, not for herself, for the baby, so that when the child grew up and asked, "Was Daddy there when you saw my heartbeat?" she could say, "Yes." So she made the mistake of asking. She walked to the lounge. She knocked softly. When Maximilian opened the door, she could see the annoyance already blooming across his face. "Max, I'm sorry to interrupt. I just wanted to ask if you could come to the ultrasound tomorrow morning. It's at 9. The room went silent. 4 men stared at her. And in that silence, something shifted in Maximilian's eyes, something dark and theatrical, as if he had been waiting for an audience to perform for. "You're interrupting my evening. You embarrassed me in front of my friends, so get on your knees and apologize properly." "Max, I'm 7 months pregnant. I'm not going to—" "Then leave. Pack your things, get out, go back to whatever swamp you crawled out of." His voice was ice. "But if you want to stay in this house, if you want to keep living this life, you'll kneel and you'll apologize." The room was silent. Brock looked away. Declan watched with the detached fascination of a man watching a car accident. And Nikolai kept recording. Serafina's legs trembled, her vision blurred with tears. She thought about her grandmother. She thought about the cottage on Bayou Road. She thought about the box of letters she had never opened, the instructions she had never read. She thought about the baby inside her, the tiny heart beating in rhythm with her own. And she knelt. The marble was cold. "I'm sorry," she said. "I'm sorry for embarrassing you." Maximilian smiled. He took a sip of his whiskey. "That's better." He closed the door in her face. Serafina stayed on the floor for a long time. She didn't move, she didn't cry. She just knelt there, in the hallway of a penthouse that costs more than most people would earn in a lifetime, and she felt the last thread of her hope snap. But here's what Maximilian didn't know. Here's what none of them knew. Something was already in motion, something that had been set in motion years ago by a tiny woman with silver hair and hands that smelled like lavender, sitting on a porch in Thibodeau, watching the sun go down over the bayou. The quietest rivers carry the most gold. The next morning, Serafina went to her ultrasound alone. She sat in the waiting room at the women's pavilion, her eyes red, her wrists still bearing the faint marks from where Maximilian had gripped her the night before. The receptionist, a kind woman named Jolene, noticed. "Honey, are you okay?" Serafina forced a smile. "I'm fine, just tired." But she wasn't fine, and Jolene could see it. The older woman didn't press, but she made a quiet note in the file. She had seen this before, too many times. Dr. Amara Osei, Serafina's obstetrician, was a tall, elegant woman with close-cropped hair and steady hands. She had been practicing for 20 years, and she had an instinct for trouble. When she called Serafina into the examination room, she noticed the same things Jolene had: the redness around the eyes, the faint bruising, the way Serafina flinched when asked to extend her arm for the blood pressure cuff. "Serafina," Dr. Osei said gently, after the ultrasound showed a healthy, active baby, "I want to ask you something, and I need you to be honest with me. Are you safe at home?" Serafina's chin trembled. She pressed her lips together. For a long moment, she said nothing. Then, in a voice so small it barely existed, she said, "I don't know." Dr. Osei nodded slowly. She didn't push, she didn't lecture. She simply placed her hand on Serafina's and said, "You have more power than you think, and when you're ready, there are people who will help you." Serafina left the clinic with the ultrasound photo tucked into her purse and Dr. Osei's words echoing in her mind. "You have more power than you think." She wanted to believe that, she really did, but how could she? She had nothing, she was nothing. At least that's what Maximilian had spent the past year convincing her of. When she returned to the penthouse, she found it empty. Maximilian had left a note on the kitchen counter. "Gone to the club, don't wait up, and clean the lounge, it smells like cigars." Serafina stood in the kitchen, staring at the note, and something inside her shifted. It was small, almost imperceptible, like the first crack in a dam. She didn't know what it was yet, but it felt like the beginning of something. She cleaned the lounge. She found empty glasses, cigar ash, a woman's earring behind one of the cushions. Small, diamond, expensive, not hers. She held it in her palm for a long time, turning it over, watching the light catch the facets. Then she placed it on the mantel, right where Maximilian would see it. Let him know she knew. That evening, she went to the bedroom closet and pulled out the box her grandmother had left her. She had brought it from Thibodeau when she moved in with Maximilian, but had never opened it beyond the first glance. It was a simple wooden box, hand-carved with a small brass latch. Inside were letters, dozens of them, written in Rosalind's careful, looping cursive, and beneath the letters a sealed envelope with Serafina's name on it, accompanied by a single word in the corner: instructions. Serafina sat on the bed and opened the envelope. Inside was a letter and a key. The letter read, "My dearest Serafina, if you are reading this, then I am gone, and you are likely in need of what I have left behind. I was never a rich woman by the world's standards, chérie, but I was rich in ways the world does not measure. Your grandfather, my beloved Henry, was a man of great secrecy and greater foresight. He came to this country from Marseille with nothing but a leather suitcase and a head for numbers. What he built quietly. He never wanted attention, he never wanted the world to know what he had done, and so when he passed, he left it all in trust. Not in his name, not in mine, in yours. The key enclosed will open a safe deposit box at Hargrove and Whitfield Private Bank, Branch 7 in New Orleans. The box is registered under the Moreau Family Trust. You are the sole beneficiary. Inside you will find the documents you need. I never told you this because I wanted you to build your own life first. I wanted you to know that your value comes from who you are, not from what you have. But life is unpredictable, and if you ever find yourself in need, this is your lifeline. The bank will know who you are. Ask for Mr. Aldrich Fontaine. He was a friend of your grandfather's. He will help you. Remember, chérie, still water runs deep. All my love, Grandmère Rosalind." Serafina read the letter 3 times. Her hands were shaking so badly that the paper rattled between her fingers. Hargrove and Whitfield Private Bank, the same bank that bared her husband's family name, the same institution that funded Maximilian's entire existence. Her grandfather had placed a trust in that bank, for her. She didn't know how much it was, she didn't know the details, but she held the key in her hand, and for the first time in over a year, she felt something she had almost forgotten: hope. Maximilian was mid-sentence, telling a story about a yacht race in Monaco when the sound cut through the room. He frowned. He hadn't invited anyone else. "Serafina," he called out, "get the door." She dried her hands on a towel and walked to the entrance. She opened the door, and there he was, Aldrich Fontaine, in a tailored navy suit, his silver hair combed neatly, a leather briefcase in his hand. Behind him stood Genevieve Thatcher, a court officer, and 2 security personnel from the bank. "Good evening, Serafina," Aldrich said with a warm nod. "May we come in?" Serafina stepped aside. The group entered the penthouse and walked toward the lounge. The conversation died as the guests noticed the new arrivals. Maximilian set his champagne down slowly. "Aldrich," he said, his brow furrowing, "what are you doing here? This is a private event." "I'm aware," Aldrich said calmly. He surveyed the room with the quiet authority of a man who had spent half a century in the company of the powerful and the pretentious. "And I apologize for the intrusion, but I'm afraid this couldn't wait." Constance rose from her chair. "Mr. Fontaine, this is highly irregular. Whatever business you have can be conducted at the bank on Monday." "With respect, Mrs. Hargrove, this business is not with you." Aldrich turned and looked at Serafina. "It's with Mrs. Moreau." The room went very still. Maximilian looked from Aldrich to Serafina and back again. "Moreau? She's a Hargrove. She's my wife. Whatever you need to say to her, you can say to me." Aldrich reached into his briefcase and removed a folder. He placed it on the coffee table with the care of a man handling something sacred. "Mr. Hargrove," he said, his voice measured, "I have served this institution for 46 years. I have managed the accounts of your family, your father, your grandfather, and your brother. I have done so with loyalty and discretion. But my first and oldest obligation, a promise I made before you were even born, is to the Moreau Family Trust." He opened the folder. "Mrs. Serafina Moreau, born Serafina Elise Moreau, is the sole beneficiary of an irrevocable trust established by Henri Moreau in 1974. The current value of the trust, inclusive of all holdings, dividends, and reinvestments, is $412 million. The room didn't just go silent, the room stopped breathing. Declan's champagne glass slipped from his fingers and shattered on the marble floor. Nobody flinched. Constance's mouth opened, but no sound came out. Brock stared at the floor. Nikolai's phone was nowhere to be seen for the first time all night. And Maximilian looked like a man who had just watched the ground open beneath his feet. His face went white, then red, then something beyond color, a translucent, trembling gray, the color of a man whose entire reality had just been dismantled in front of everyone he had ever tried to impress. "That's not possible," he whispered. "It is not only possible. It is a matter of legal record. The trust has been held in escrow at this institution since its creation. I have personally overseen its management for the past 30 years at the request of Henri Moreau and subsequently at the request of his widow, Rosalind." He turned to Serafina. "Mrs. Moreau, the trust is fully activated and at your disposal. All documents have been verified by our legal team and by Miss Thatcher here." Genevieve stepped forward. She was a tall woman with sharp cheekbones and the kind of presence that made people straighten their posture involuntarily. "Additionally," Genevieve said, addressing the room but looking directly at Maximilian, "I have been retained as Mrs. Moreau's family attorney. I am serving Mr. Hargrove with divorce papers effective immediately." She placed a second folder on the table. These papers include a petition for full custody of the unborn child, supported by extensive documented evidence of emotional abuse, coercion, physical intimidation, and infidelity. She reached into her own briefcase and produced a USB drive. This drive contains security footage from this penthouse, recordings obtained through a sealed court order which show Mr. Hargrove engaging in verbal abuse, forced humiliation, and threatening behavior toward his pregnant wife. It also contains a sworn statement from Miss Vivienne Laurent detailing a year-long extramarital affair, along with evidence that Mr. Hargrove misrepresented his marital status to Miss Laurent and misappropriated family bank funds for personal gifts. Constance finally found her voice. "This is outrageous. This is a setup. This woman, this nobody from the bayou, she's clearly manipulated." "Mrs. Hargrove," Aldrich interrupted, and his voice, though quiet, carried the weight of a glacier. "I would advise you to choose your next words very carefully. Mrs. Moreau's trust represents a larger financial interest than your family's combined holdings. As a matter of institutional protocol, the bank's primary fiduciary obligation is to its largest client. As of this moment, that client is Mrs. Moreau." The silence that followed was absolute. Constance sat down. She actually sat down, as if her legs had been cut from under her. Her pearl gray suit suddenly looked like armor that no longer fit. Maximilian was breathing hard. His chest rose and fell in rapid, uneven bursts. He turned to Serafina, and for the first time, perhaps the first time in his entire life, he looked at her and saw her. Not as a tool, not as a transaction, not as someone beneath him. He saw her as someone who had just quietly and without fanfare become the most powerful person in the room with everyone he had ever tried to impress. "Sarah," he said, his voice cracked. "Sarah, listen to me. I can explain. We can work this out. Don't." Her voice was calm, steady, but there was a weight to it that silenced him instantly. "Don't call me that. You lost the right to call me that the night you made me kneel on this floor." She stepped forward, not toward him, past him. She walked to the center of the room, and every eye followed her. Her belly was round and full, her face was bare of makeup, her dress was simple, and she was the most commanding presence in a room full of people who had spent their entire lives trying to command. "I want you all to hear this, because some of you were here that night, some of you watched, some of you laughed, and some of you recorded." She looked at Nikolai. He turned the color of chalk. "I came into this marriage with nothing. That's what you all believed. That's what Maximilian told you, and that's what I believed too. I believed I was nobody. I believed I had nothing to offer. I believed that my value was determined by the man standing next to me and the name on my bank account." She paused. The baby kicked. She placed her hand on her belly. "But my grandmother taught me something that none of you seem to understand. Worth is measured not in dollars. It's measured in how you treat people when you think they have nothing, and every single person in this room failed that test." She turned to Maximilian. "You married me because you needed a wife and a child to unlock your trust fund. You never loved me. You never even liked me. I was a means to an end, a body to carry your heir, and when I served my purpose, you planned to throw me away." Maximilian's mouth opened, closed, opened again. "Sarah, that's not. I did love you. In the beginning, In the beginning, you pretended, and you were very, very good at it. But pretending isn't loving, Maximilian, and I'm done pretending too." She turned to Aldrich. "Mr. Fontaine, I'd like to proceed." Aldrich nodded. He opened a final document and read it aloud. "Effective immediately, Mrs. Serafina Moreau exercises her right, as the bank's largest individual trust holder, to call for a review of the Hargrove Family Trust's morality clause. Given documented evidence of moral turpitude, including infidelity, emotional abuse, and misappropriation of funds, the bank's board will convene within 30 days to determine whether Mr. Hargrove has met the ethical conditions required for the release of his $30 million trust." Maximilian staggered backward as if he had been physically struck. "You can't do that. That's my money, my family's bank. You can't." "The bank serves its clients, Mr. Hargrove, all of its clients, and Mrs. Moreau has every legal right to request this review.
The board will decide. Genevieve stepped forward one final time. Mr. Hargrove, you have been served. You have 30 days to respond to the divorce petition. I would strongly advise you to retain counsel. The custody evidence alone will be very difficult to contest. The court officer handed Maximilian the papers. He took them with hands that were visibly shaking. He looked down at the documents, then up at Serafina, then around at the faces of his friends, his mother, his peers, all of whom were now looking at him the way he once looked at his wife. With pity, with contempt, with the cold, appraising eye of people who measure others by what they have, and what Maximilian had, suddenly, was very, very little. Serafina walked toward the door. Aldrich and Genevieve flanked her.
"Maximilian," she said, "the floor is cold, isn't it?" She didn't wait for an answer. She walked out of the penthouse and into the elevator. The doors closed. She leaned against the wall, placed both hands on her belly, and finally allowed herself to cry. Not from sadness, not from pain, but from the overwhelming, flooding relief of a woman who had just walked out of a cage she didn't know she had the key to all along. The weeks that followed were a storm. Maximilian hired 3 lawyers, then 5, then 7. Each one reviewed the case and came to the same conclusion. He was in deep trouble. The prenup, his great weapon, was irrelevant. Serafina's trust was untouchable. The security footage was devastating. Vivian's testimony was corroborated by text messages, hotel records, and financial transfers. And the morality clause review, initiated by Serafina's request, had frozen his $30 million trust indefinitely. He tried calling Serafina. She had changed her number. He tried showing up at her new residence, a graceful townhouse in the Garden District that Aldrich had helped her purchase within days of the confrontation. Security turned him away at the gate. He tried sending messages through mutual acquaintances. They went unanswered. He even tried, in a moment of desperate, pathetic irony, sending wildflowers. Serafina looked at them for a long time. Then she gave them to Jolene, the receptionist at Dr. Osai's office, who had been the first person in months to ask if she was okay. The divorce proceedings moved swiftly. Genevieve was ruthless in the courtroom. The security footage was played in full. Every second of the kneeling incident, every cruel word, every moment of dehumanization. The judge, a 70-year-old woman named Honorable Celeste Beauregard, watched without expression. When the footage ended, she removed her glasses and looked at Maximilian with the quiet fury of someone who had spent a lifetime pursuing justice. "Mr. Hargrove," Judge Beauregard said, "in my 30 years on the bench, I have seen cruelty in many forms, but the deliberate humiliation of a pregnant woman for the entertainment of your peers represents a special category of moral failure." She granted Serafina full custody. She granted a restraining order. And while the prenup technically prevented alimony, the judge noted on the record that Mr. Hargrove's conduct had been so far beneath the standard of a reasonable person that she was referring the case to the state's domestic abuse task force for further investigation. Maximilian lost his trust fund. The bank's board, after reviewing the evidence, determined that his conduct constituted a clear violation of the morality clause. $30 million, the money he had married Serafina to obtain, was redirected into a charitable endowment. Constance Hargrove tried to intervene, calling in favors, threatening board members, even attempting to have Aldrich Fontaine removed from his position. None of it worked. The board's decision was unanimous. Nikolai's recording of the kneeling incident leaked online, not from Serafina. She had nothing to do with it. It leaked because Nikolai, in a moment of drunken stupidity, had shown it to someone at a bar, and that someone had a conscience and a phone. Within 48 hours, the video had been viewed millions of times. The internet, for all its cruelty, occasionally finds the right target, and it found Maximilian Hargrove. His social circle evaporated. Declan stopped returning his calls. Brock publicly distanced himself. Nikolai was fired from his law firm after it was revealed that he had recorded a private individual in a private residence without consent, a violation of Louisiana's wiretapping statutes.
Maximilian's older brother, Prescott, the family heir, issued a public statement disassociating himself from his brother. The Hargrove name, Prescott wrote, stands for integrity, generosity, and respect. My brother has failed to uphold these values, and his actions do not represent our family. It was a cold, corporate disavowal, but it was effective. Maximilian, in every way that mattered, was alone. He moved out of the penthouse. He couldn't afford it anymore. Without the trust fund and with his reputation in ruins, his financial position was precarious. The lifestyle, the champagne, the suits, the club memberships, all of it had been funded by the promise of that trust and by the family name that now wanted nothing to do with him. He sold his watch collection, then his car, then the art on his walls, pieces he had once used as conversation starters at dinner parties, now sold quietly through a second-hand dealer on Magazine Street. He rented an apartment in a mid-rise on the outskirts of the city, a one-bedroom with water stains on the ceiling and a view of a parking lot. He drank too much. He called his mother, who answered less and less frequently. He called Vivian, who had blocked his number. He called Serafina one last time, from a blocked number, and when she answered, he said only 2 words, "I'm sorry." Serafina was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "I believe you are, but sorry doesn't undo what you did. It doesn't give me back the nights I spent crying alone. It doesn't erase the image of my knees on that floor. It doesn't change the fact that you looked at me, pregnant with your child, and decided I was less than human." "I know," he whispered. "I hope you learn from this, Maximilian. I really do. Not for my sake, for yours." She hung up, and that was the last time they ever spoke. Serafina's baby was born on a warm October morning at Tulane Medical Center. A boy, 7 pounds, 8 ounces. He had his mother's dark eyes and a full head of curly hair. When the nurse placed him on Serafina's chest, she felt something break open inside her, not from pain, but from a love so vast and so complete that it made everything else, the cruelty, the humiliation, the loneliness, seem like the prologue to a story that was only now truly beginning. She named Henry after her grandfather. Dr. Osai was there, smiling from the corner of the delivery room. Aldrich Fontaine sent a hand-carved wooden rattle made by an artisan in Marseille, the same city Henri Moreau had come from decades ago. Genevieve sent a card that read, "Welcome to the world, little one. Your mother is the strongest person I've ever met." Serafina took Henry home to the townhouse in the Garden District. She had furnished it simply but warmly, nothing like the cold glass tower of the penthouse. There were bookshelves filled with novels, a kitchen that smelled of roux and fresh bread, a nursery painted in soft greens and yellows, with a window that overlooked a garden of magnolias. On the mantel, she placed a framed photograph of Rosalind, sitting on the porch of the cottage in Thibodeau, her silver hair catching the sunset, a quiet smile on her face. Beside it, she placed the ultrasound photo from her 7th month, the one she had carried in her purse the day she had knelt on the marble floor, and beside that, a small wooden box with a brass latch, empty now, because everything it had contained had been set free. In the months that followed, Serafina began to rebuild, not just her life, but herself. She used a small portion of the trust to establish the Rosalind Moreau Foundation, a nonprofit dedicated to supporting pregnant women in abusive relationships. The foundation provided legal aid, temporary housing, financial counseling, and most importantly, the one thing Serafina lacked during her darkest period of her life, the knowledge that they were not alone. She hired staff. She partnered with hospitals and shelters across Louisiana. She gave her first public speech at a women's conference in Baton Rouge, standing behind a podium with Henry sleeping in a carrier beside her, and she told her story. Not the polished version, not the sanitized version, the real version. The kneeling, the cold floor, the fear, the silence. The audience was in tears. The standing ovation lasted 4 minutes. She didn't mention Maximilian by name. She didn't need to. The world already knew. After the speech, a young woman approached her backstage. She couldn't have been older than 22. Her eyes were red, her wrists were covered by long sleeves despite the Louisiana heat, and she was holding a baby in a carrier that looked like it had been repaired with duct tape. "I watched the video," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "the one of you on the floor, and I thought, if she can get up from that, maybe I can too." Serafina looked at the young woman for a long time. Then she reached out and gently touched her shoulder. "What's your name?" "Margot." "Margot, you're already up. You're here. That took more courage than anything I've ever done." Margot's face crumbled. She cried, and Serafina held her. Right there backstage, two strangers connected by the universal language of survival. The baby between them cooed softly, oblivious to the weight of the moment, which was perhaps the most beautiful thing about it. Margot became the first recipient of the Foundation's emergency relocation program. Within a month, she had a safe apartment, a legal advocate, and a part-time job at a bookstore in the Garden District. Within a year, she was enrolled in community college. Within 3, she had earned her associate's degree and was working as a paralegal at Genevieve Thatcher's firm. Every time Serafina thought about quitting, about retreating into the comfort of her wealth and her quiet life, she thought about Margot, about the long sleeves in the summer heat, about the duct-taped baby carrier, about the trembling voice that said, "If she can get up from that, maybe I can too." That was the real inheritance, not $400 million, not a key in a wooden box. The real inheritance was the understanding that when you survive something terrible, your survival becomes a lantern for someone else.
Serafina was in the audience. She cried. For the last time, she hoped. But they were good tears, the kind that wash clean. Years passed. Henry grew into a bright, curious boy with his mother's gentle spirit and his great-grandfather's sharp mind. He attended a good school. He played soccer in the park. He asked about his father sometimes, and Serafina answered honestly, carefully, without cruelty. "Your father made mistakes," she told him. "Big ones, but he's still your father. And when you're older, if you want to know him, that will be your choice." Henry considered this with the seriousness only a 5-year-old can muster. Then he said, "Do I have to?" Serafina smiled. "No, baby, you don't have to do anything you don't want to do. Not ever." She kissed his forehead. He smelled like sunscreen and peanut butter. There was one more chapter to this story. One final scene that Serafina didn't plan and didn't expect, but that arrived the way most important things do, without warning. It was a Sunday afternoon in March. Henry was 6 years old. They were at the farmer's market in the French Quarter, the one on Decatur Street, where vendors sold pralines and fresh tomatoes and hand-poured candles. Henry was holding a small bag of strawberries, eating them one by one, his lips stained red. And there, standing behind a produce stall, was Maximilian. Serafina almost didn't recognize him. He had aged a decade in 6 years. His hair, once dark and meticulously styled, was streaked with gray and uncombed. His face was thinner, harder, the sharp jaw now gaunt rather than chiseled. He was wearing jeans and a faded flannel shirt, the kind of clothes he would have once set fire to rather than be seen in. He was arranging tomatoes on a wooden table, and when he looked up and saw her, he froze. For a long, suspended moment, they just looked at each other. Two people who had once shared a life, a bed, the creation of a child, standing 10 feet apart in a crowd of strangers buying heirloom vegetables. Henry tugged on Serafina's hand. "Mama, can we get peaches?" "In a minute, baby." Maximilian's eyes moved to Henry, and something in his face crumbled. Not dramatically, not with a sob or a gasp, just a quiet internal collapse, like a building that had been slowly deteriorating, finally letting go of its last standing wall. He opened his mouth, closed it, tried again. "He looks like you," he said. His voice was rough, unused, the voice of a man who didn't talk to many people anymore. "He looks like my grandmother," Serafina corrected gently. Maximilian nodded. He stared at Henry for another moment, and then he looked at Serafina, and in his eyes she saw something she had never seen before, not in the early days of their courtship when he had been performing, not during the marriage when he had been controlling, not even on the night of the confrontation when he had been panicking. She saw remorse. Real remorse. The kind that lives in the marrow and never fully heals. "I work here now," he gestured vaguely at the stall. 3 days a week. The rest of the time I'm at, well, he rubbed the back of his neck. I volunteer at a shelter downtown, the one on Baronne Street. Serafina blinked. She knew that shelter. It was one of the partner organizations of her foundation. "They don't know who I am," he continued quickly. "I didn't use my last name. I needed to do something. After everything, I needed to do something that wasn't selfish." There was a long silence. Henry ate another strawberry. "I'm not asking for forgiveness," Maximilian said. "I know I don't deserve it. I know what I did. I replay it every single night. The floor, the way you looked at me, the way I—" He stopped. His jaw tightened. "I can't undo any of it, but I'm trying to be different. I don't know if it matters, but I'm trying." Serafina looked at him for a long time. She studied the lines on his face, the calluses on his hands, the faded flannel that would have appalled the man he used to be. She thought about the marble floor. She thought about the coldness. She thought about how close she had come to believing she was nothing. And then she thought about what her grandmother would do. Rosalind, who had endured poverty and loss and the death of a husband and the death of a daughter, and who had somehow impossibly remained kind. "It matters," Serafina said quietly. "The trying matters." Maximilian's eyes glistened. He pressed his lips together and nodded once, sharply, as if he were trying to hold himself together. "Can I—" he looked at Henri. "Can I know his name?" "Henri," Serafina said. "His name is Henri." Something passed across Maximilian's face. Recognition, understanding. The name of the man whose fortune he had never known about, the man whose legacy had been the instrument of his undoing, and also, perhaps, of his eventual redemption. "It's a good name," he said softly. "Yes," Serafina said, "it is." She didn't invite him into Henri's life, not that day, maybe not ever. That wasn't her decision to make alone, and Henri was still too young to make it, but she didn't walk away with hatred either. She walked away with something quieter, something that felt like the last page of a very long book finally being turned. Peace. Not the absence of pain, not the forgetting of wounds, but the conscious, deliberate choice to set down the weight of someone else's cruelty and walk forward without it. That night, after Henri was in bed, Serafina sat on the back porch of her townhouse with a glass of sweet tea and watched the stars appear over the garden district, one by one, like small, distant promises. She thought about the journey, the whole impossible journey, from Thibodeau to Tulane, from a cubicle to a penthouse, from the cold marble floor to this warm wooden porch. She thought about her mother, Colette, hanging laundry on a Tuesday afternoon, gone in the time it takes to unfold a bedsheet. She thought about her father, Gaston, drowning his grief one glass at a time. She thought about Rosalind, tiny and fierce, pressing wildflowers into books and hiding a $400 million secret inside a wooden box with a brass latch. She thought about how the world works, how it rewards confidence and punishes kindness, how the loudest voices get the most attention and the quietest ones get overlooked, how people like Maximilian are built by a system that tells them they are worth more because they have more, and people like Serafina are told they are worth less because they have less. And she thought about how wrong that system is, how fundamentally, catastrophically, irredeemably wrong. Because worth isn't a bank balance. Worth isn't a last name.
Worth isn't a penthouse with a river view, or a suit from Tom Ford, or a mother in Chanel who measures people the way you measure livestock. Worth is what you do when no one is watching. Worth is how you treat someone who can't help you. Worth is whether you can look at a pregnant woman on her knees and feel something break inside you, or whether you can take a sip of whiskey and smile. Maximilian smiled that night, and it cost him everything. Serafina knelt that night, and it gave her everything. Not the money. The money was incidental, a tool, a useful one, yes, but not the source of her power. Her power came from the same place it had always come from, the place her grandmother had nurtured and protected and prayed over for years. Her spirit, her refusal to be less than she was, her ability to be brought to her knees and still somehow carry herself like a queen. The foundation grew. Within 3 years, the Rosalind Moreau Foundation had expanded to 7 states. It had helped over 4,000 women leave dangerous situations. It had funded shelters, legal aid clinics, and a scholarship program for single mothers pursuing higher education. Serafina spoke at conferences, universities, and legislative hearings. She testified before a state committee about the economic dimensions of domestic abuse, her finance degree finally serving the purpose it was always meant to serve. She was featured in national magazines, not as a victim, not as a tabloid curiosity, but as a builder, a creator, a woman who had taken the worst experience of her life and turned it into a lighthouse for others. And if you look carefully at every interview, every photograph, every public appearance, you'll notice something. Around her neck, on a simple gold chain, she wears a small brass key, the same key that opened the safe deposit box at Hargrove and Whitfield Private Bank, the key her grandmother left her, the key that changed everything. But the key didn't change her. That's the important part. The key unlocked a door, but Serafina was the one who walked through it, with her shoulders back, with her head up, with the quiet, unshakable grace of a woman who had been to the bottom and chosen, deliberately and defiantly, to rise. And in that moment, kneeling beside her son, not because she had been forced to, but because she chose to, Serafina Moreau understood what her grandmother had been trying to tell her all along. Still water runs deep, and the quietest rivers carry the most gold. Not gold as in money, not gold as in bank accounts and trust funds and the brittle architecture of wealth. Gold as in the things that matter. Kindness, dignity, the refusal to be broken, the courage to kneel, and the strength to stand back up. That is the gold Rosalind left her. That is the gold Serafina carried forward. And that is the gold she gave to her son. Because in the end, this story isn't about money. It isn't about revenge. It isn't about a man who forced his pregnant wife to beg on her knees and the spectacular way it all came crashing down on him. This story is about a woman who was told she was nothing, who was treated like nothing, who was made to feel like nothing, and who, when the moment came, stood up. Not because she was rich, not because she had $400 million in a trust she didn't know about, but because she was Serafina Moreau, granddaughter of Rosalind, granddaughter of Henri, a woman from a small town that doesn't appear on most maps, with a library card and second-hand shoes and a heart that refused, absolutely refused to stay on its knees. And if you're listening to this and any part of this story felt familiar, if you've ever been told you are nothing, if you've ever been made to kneel, if you've ever looked in the mirror and wondered whether the person staring at you had any worth at all, then I want you to hear this. You do. You have more worth than you know, more strength than you've been allowed to show. And the people who tried to make you small, they were afraid. Afraid one day you'd stand up, and when you did, you'd be taller than they ever were. Still water runs deep, and the quietest rivers carry the most gold. Remember that.